Thank you so much. Welcome all to this instruction course. It's been a privilege and pleasure to have my esteemed co-instructors, and I must say they are actually the instructors because I don't tend to do a talk. I'd like to just be a part of the course because they give such excellent input. And I would first welcome all of you all. I don't think Dhananjay will be joining us. I would probably be giving his talk. So we have many clinical scenarios in DME and we don't really have clear-cut solutions or answers. So we do want to make the treatment sustained and successful for our patients. So how can we reduce the burden on them, be it investigative or treatment? So this IC is basically about discussing the optimal management options with the very best in the field. As you can all see, we have Dr. MPS, we have Dr. Atul Kumar, we have Dr. Lalit Verma, we have Dr. Dogra, and I have my colleague, Dr. Santosh, as well. They will talk to us in a case-based and a practical approach where we will also have some panel discussion and audience questions, if any. So first and foremost, we'll talk about basically how Okta can help us in DME monitoring. Does it have a role being non-invasive, and more easily repeatable? Santosh would tell us more about it. And glad to see you there, Dhananjay. I was hoping that I don't have to do your talk, so I'm glad you'll be doing it yourself. So welcome all, and we'll start off with Santosh. Over to you, Santosh.
The screen is seen, right?
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Good morning. At the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. Chaitra for this opportunity to be speaking alongside the who's who of retina. It's a great honor. So I'll be talking about Okta for DME monitoring. Does it really have a role? So these layers that are the readout layers that are Okta, these are one of the commonest readout that we usually see in day-to-day practice now. So this we all know is the superficial plexus. This is the deeper plexus. This is the outer retina, and this is the choroid. So these four layers are the default layers what we see, and but the layers of interest today are the superficial plexus, wherein we can see these larger vessels, and this is the FAZ. And this is a DCP. This is a deep capillary plexus. We can see a very close knit of vessels over here. So we'll be talking about the changes in these layers that happen in a diabetic macular edema. So even before any changes happen, structural changes happen in macular OCT in diabetes. So we do get to see some changes that happen in Okta. So these are very early changes that do happen, like a change in the vasculature, a change in the FAZ as well. So we did publish a paper wherein we saw that over a period of time with the severity, with an increasing severity of the diabetic retinopathy, we could see that there were changes in the FAZ as well as the changes in the capillary plexuses in different layers. So, but when we looked at these things with a statistical analysis, we found that when it goes to severe stages, the spacing between the larger vessels had increased, wherein we looked at the initial phases like a mild NPDR or something. The changes happened between the smaller vessels. And FAZ really didn't change much because these were the eyes wherein there was no macular edema. These were flat maculas. These were just the changes that happened over severity of diabetic retinopathy. And this is the inbuilt software in the machine what we are using, the OptoView. So this is how we see initially the dropout areas, the changes in the FAZ, and this is a color-coded map. The blue colors obviously mean less vascular supply, and the hotter areas represent a more vascular supply. And when we look at diabetic retinopathy with the macular edema, and if these two scans are given for a readout, we obviously tend to mistake these changes in the deep capillary plexus to be enlarged FAZ or a macular ischemia or severe dropout of vascular areas. But when we see these in combination with an UNFAS image, this is an UNFAS image of the superficial plexus. This is one of the deep capillary plexus and OCTB scan. So whenever we are interpreting an Okta image, OCTB scan is a must. So when we see what section of the layer it is passing through, that gives us an idea where we are really looking at. And when we look at these cystic spaces, this obviously is passing through the areas of macular edema. So this gives rise to an impression that there is a capillary dropout, which is not. This is a comparison with an FA, the angiography. So we can see an aneurysmal dilatation here. This is a superficial capillary plexus. This is a deep one. So we know that aneurysms can exist even superficial as well as deep capillary plexus. So this particular aneurysmal dilatation especially is seen in SCP, not in DCP. So, but other aneurysms can be seen in the DCP, and we can see a change in the FAZ both in SCP as well as a DCP. Another case wherein we can see in the SCP as well as the DCP. And if you look at the morphological pattern of the macular edema, there's a subretinal fluid, intraretinal fluid. So obviously when the scan passes through this, the superficial plexus, it can pass through the layers of the retina, but once it comes to the deep capillary plexus, it has to pass through the areas of edema, so which gives rise to this kind of a scan. And aneurysms can obviously be seen in some scans wherein it passes through aneurysms. And a severely deranged and disturbed macula, if you look at here, lots of cystoid spaces and hyperreflective material, and even there's quite a loss of parallelism. So when we look at an octa, so it's quite a picture wherein we just feel that there is a loss of structure there. But once you look at a B scan and UNFAS, we get to know what really we are looking into. This is a case of a non-responding DME. If you look at the morphological pattern of macular edema, again, we can see the intraretinal, the intercystic hyperreflective material, lots of aneurysm here, loss of parallelism, and most probably drill also. This is a superficial octa image as well as an UNFAS, and this is a deep. So we can see the irregular pattern of the vasculature on the DCP, and the similar thing reflects even on UNFAS. So we get to know what really we are looking into. UNFAS also really helps to kind of judge whether how bad is the DME and how much is the extent of the macular edema. So there were various papers which presented which showed that when there's a good response DME, the aneurysms were less, and when compared to a poor response DME in a deep capillary plexus, aneurysms were more. So this is again a correlation that was done by Lee et al., wherein they saw that in a good response DME, just the FAZ changes were there. There were some aneurysms, but when they looked at a bad response DME, they could see that in the morphological, the B scan, OCT B scan, the OPL was disturbed. So wherever the OPL was disturbed, so the cysts in the inner nuclear was obviously like they're communicating with the outer nuclear layer. So the same can be seen on a DCP layer. We can see a capillary dropout areas. So coming to the importance of DCP, now we know that DCP is extremely important for the macular edema as such, because more aneurysms are there over there, and it is a voluminous layer, 60 microns. The blood flow in DCP is extremely important because there is a synapse of bipolar cells and photoreceptor cells that happen here, and because OPL acts as a fluid barrier, the intraretinal cysts which are present in the inner and outer nuclear layer are kept at bay. But once this is breached, they communicate, and it results in a non-responding DME. And DCP provides 15% of oxygen supply to the photoreceptors inner and outer nuclear layers. So disruption of this layered structure can easily predict the outcome of diabetic macular edema. There are other studies which showed that the areas of macular edema have more aneurysms when compared to the areas which do not have macular edema. So coming to macrosysms in DME, all the studies, they come to one conclusion which say that when there is edema, the aneurysms are more, and they are more in the DCP. But when we look at an angiography comparison with an octa comparison, only 62% of aneurysms which are detected by fluorescein angiography could be detected in octa. That could be because of the difference in flows. There could be high flows, there could be low flows, there could be infarcts and various other things. So there's another study which showed that before and after Ozurdex injections, the dexamethasone implant, they did not really find significant changes in the SCP as well as DCP, wherein choroid they found that there's a little better visualization of the coarse architecture, obviously because of the decrease in macular edema spaces. But what they found was the changes were more in the parafoveal area, both in the SCP as well as the DCP. The other thing what we need to keep in mind is a pseudoflow. These are the artifacts that we see, especially the hard exudates. When the eye moves, the saccades that happen, they tend to project these hard exudants aneurysms as pseudoflow. So these are called suspended scattering particles in motion. So these are not flow areas, but these are the areas which do not have flow, but these are hard exudates or something which kind of give rise to a false impression of a flow. So this is a latest article which compared the Zeiss plexellite and AngioView. Zeiss plexellite is a SSOCT, this is an SDOCT. So what they had noticed, if you look at the scan structure here, it passes through the area which doesn't have a macular edema. So if you see the same area which passes through, there is a clear-cut capillary dropout. But when you look at this hyperreflective area, this passes through the intraretinal, the cystic space. So these cystic spaces are hyperreflective. So what they say is these have the suspended, the SS PIM. So they say that when there is no there is capillary dropout, and when it passes through the normal retina, so this means that there is a capillary non-perfusion. But when it passes through the areas of cystic, it doesn't mean that there's a non-perfusion. It just means that there is SSPIM. And when they compared it with Zeiss plexellite with AngioView, they found that Zeiss plexellite is more sensitive to detect this SSPM when compared to AngioView. And there's another phenomenon that can happen when there's a macular edema. So the vessels do get displaced over a period of time. They kind of get pushed because of the intraretinal fluid. So we can see the disappearance of the vessels, then again reappearance of the vessels. We can see the vessels were not there here, but after the edema resolution, we can see the reappearance of the vessels. So this doesn't really mean that there's a vessel loss, there's a macular ischemia, but we need to look at the scans when there's a return of macular architecture. So there are studies which even kind of monitored the types of microorganism, or 1 year what was the hyperreflective microorganism which was there that remained to be hyperreflective, wherein the hypo ones they remain to be hypo. So coming to the features, what we need to really kind of keep in mind when we are interpreting an OCTA. So FAZ and vessel visibility can change once the macular edema decreases. That could be because of the remodeling of the vessels, as we discussed, vessel displacement and capillary changes, and even a change in the vessel flow velocity. And even the FAZ also changes because of the vascular changes secondary to DME, fluid shadowing, and loss of signals, and several other artifacts. So coming to the difficulties in interpreting OCTA in DME, it could be because of the differentiation and segmentation difficulties in anatomically completely distorted scans, projection artifacts, and there can be several other misleading features like edema and hard exudates.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. The time is up. Need to conclude.
Yeah, I'm just concluding. Yeah. So to conclude, OCTA really helps in kind of prognosticating the macular edema, to checking out the microorganisms and non-perfusion areas. And it could be a really helpful tool in the investigative modality, as well as basically the prognosis and the academic interest as such. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Santosh. That was actually quite an in-depth talk into the use of OCTA. I think we'll have the discussion in the end if it's okay with the panel, or would you all prefer to do it as and when you finish your talk?
I think it's better if we do it as and when.
Okay, sure, sir. So I had two quick questions. One is in case of very, very severe edema, would you have any pointers as to what is the main thing that you need to see? Because you said there are a lot of difficulties when the edema is severe on OCTA. So what is the one point that you would like to elaborate on that one should look for in the on the OCTA image?
I think it's basically the OCT-B scan that we need to rely on. OCTA, maybe there would be issues even with the fixation. So it will be quite a deranged scan. So it would be really difficult to pinpoint and say that these are the prognostic indicators. So as we progress, as we kind of follow up these cases, I think then it gives some idea like what we are really looking into, since the vascular changes do happen. Even aneurysms for this matter are not really easy. These are all typical case-based scenarios, I believe, which are published and which we took out for the presentation. But it would be really difficult to kind of say when in a very severe macular edema cases. Yeah.
Santosh, I have a basic question.
Yes, yes, sir.
Is there any role of OCTA at present in DME? Basic question for the people across.
Yes, sir.
At present.
Yes,
or is it only being used as an investigative tool?
Yeah. So I feel, sir, personally, like especially to look at capillary non-perfusion, sometimes when we know that the OCTA section is passing through a normal retina, but we look like the slide wherein I showed the comparison between two machines. When we know that there could be areas of edema, there could be areas of no edema at all. But when the section passes through areas of non-edematous areas, these are the areas where we can concentrate and see whether there is a non-perfusion, what is the macular perfusion status. And obviously, over a period of time, the aneurysms, which are for academic use, but I feel like at least to prognosticate the ischemic status when we can't do an angiography, it would be really helpful.
Dr. Atul Kumar wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just said more and more we're doing these wide field octas, 12 into 12 on the top con and all, the Plex Elite. Of course, but you think it's going to take over from fluorescein finally, Santosh, after your excellent lecture? Anyway, with so much of vast knowledge you have, and Professor Dogra's expert comments.
So the little knowledge what I have, I feel Octa obviously cannot replace SA at this point of time. But the Zeiss beta version, the images what we have when it's stitched together, it obviously kind of can rule out a PDR, severe PDR cases. Aneurysms, these NVs can be seen, even IRMAs can be seen. Yeah.
Because the 12 into 12 on the top con picks up the neovascularization beautifully. You can see the individual new vessels very clearly. And the regression is also more apparent after the laser.
Yeah.
So I was wanting expert opinions from Professor Dogra, Dr. Chaitra and all. What do they feel?
I think, Professor Atul, somehow I had this Flexolite for a very long time. I think in the institute where I am, they got it right in the beginning. So I have an experience. What you said is absolutely right. I think for the patients, those who have associated proliferative diabetic retinopathy, I think it is of a great help. But as such, in a diabetic macular edema, because sometimes we do see in this exaggerated sort of a response of looking area which looks like ischemic, which may be more than because of other reasons. That is even Santosh has shown. So that is what I was saying, that maybe at this time, it may not be really a tool for DME, but in case we have associated proliferative diabetic retinopathy, as you said, you can pick up very nicely the area, the broader area of non-perfusion in a 12 by 12 scan, as well as new vessels and other changes. That is what is my take on this.
Great. I think that was a very good discussion, and we will try to limit to 15 minutes with the talk and discussion so that everybody gets, ample time. The next speaker is Dr. MPS. I'm not introducing any of the speakers because they're all so well known, and we'll save time for their gyan that they're going to give us. So when is the ideal time to switch drugs for DME? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Chaitra. Can you see my slides?
Yes, sir. See.
Yeah, okay, fine. So this is the third year in a row I'm giving this talk about like when is the ideal time to switch drugs for DME. I thought I'm going to get bored and nothing new is going to come up, but like surprisingly every year something new comes up. So here we have a patient who has this intraretinal cystoid spaces, IRF, and we gave a bevacizumab and patient responded. So there's no issue in such patients when the patient responds so beautifully. And here's another patient where the patient worsens despite the treatment. So here again, we don't have a confusion. So the patient worsens, obviously the drug is not working, you want to change. The problem comes when the patients are like this. So there is some response, but there is still intraretinal fluid and subretinal fluid, and that has not gone down completely. So these are the patients where we have a confusion whether we're going to switch to another drug or not. So when we looked at the switch criteria, there is no uniform criteria. There are 3 different studies I'm quoting here. So they looked at the central macular thickness as the criteria for switching. One study says if there is less than 20% central macular thickness reduction after 3 injections, then you think of switching. Another study says if there's worsening, when the central subfoveal thickness worsens by about 10%, then you think of switching. Another study looks at it differently, which says less than 50% reduction in excess macular thickness after 3 to 4 monthly injections, then you think of switching. And there are criteria to switch based on vision as well. So the first study says if there is less than 5 letter gain of vision, then you switch. The second one says if there is loss of more than 5 letters, then you think of switching. And the third one, if it is not improving to 20/40, then you think of switching. So it's either or. So it's either vision gain or there is no improvement in CMT. One of these things, then you think of switching to another injection is what all the studies have said. There's no uniform criteria, as I mentioned. So I hope that all of you are with me so far. So, but then before we think of switching, came up this protocol V. So do we switch in eyes with good vision? So protocol V took up these treatment naive eyes, which had visual acuity better than 6/7.5. So the comparison of aflibercept versus laser versus observation. And surprisingly, 2/3 of the observation eyes and 3/4 of the laser eyes maintained this 6/7.5, which is an excellent vision over the next 2 years without any treatment. So persistent edema in the presence of good vision, that is vision with better than 6/7.5, there's no need to switch. We can stop treatment and observe. And if there is a vision loss of 10 letters in one visit or 5 to 9 letters on subsequent 2 visits, then you need to think of reinstating the treatment. The key is to follow up these patients initially at 8 weeks to make sure that they're not worsening, they're not losing vision, and subsequently they're stable, we can increase the duration of follow-up to 16 weeks. Follow-up is the key here. We need to make a distinction. So here we talked about persistent edema with a vision of 6/7.5 or better, even if there is center involving macular edema. But if there is a non-center involving macular edema, then we go ahead and do a laser photocoagulation and we don't observe these patients. So I hope you're still with me. So next question is switch after how many injections? Most of the studies say about 5 injections, and the studies done in Asia Pacific, we are a little bit impatient, probably because of financial reasons. So we switch after 2 to 3 injections. So does the switch work? Most of the studies where they have switched to another agent say, yes, it works. Patient's vision improves and the central macular thickness also improves. But then there are contrarian views. Here is a study where they have continued the same treatment in a particular bunch of patients, and other patients switched also. So here we see that eyes that appeared refractory at 3 to 6 months after injection, that is usually the time when we switch. After 3 injections, we switch. The studies abroad have said that after 5 injections, you switch. So at the time when we wanted to switch, if you continue the same injection, what happens? So subsequent to another 3 months, there is a visual gain. So continuing the same agent for another 3 months resulted in 3 to 5 letter gain, and the central macular thickness also decreased. There's yet another study where they have found that the most of the improvement following anti-VEGF agents happens in the first 6 months. And subsequently, if you continue the same treatment, once again, 3.4 letter improvement, that's about 3 to 5 letter improvement is what you can gain in the subsequent years if you continue on the same treatment or switch to another agent. So in this study, we found that persistent edema over 2 years, bevacizumab of 2/3 of the patients on bevacizumab and ranibizumab and aflibercept, half of these eyes continued to have edema, but the edema resulted in only about 3.3% of the patients losing vision. So the edema can be there, we can tolerate fluid, but doesn't mean that all these patients we need to have a dry macula, and for the dry macula we need to switch to another agent. So what is the caveat in continuing the same treatment if we decide to continue the same treatment? Yes, it's another additional 8 to 10 injections because another 3 or 5 months you have to continue the treatment, and added cost of the treatment as well, and difficulty in convincing the patients for continued treatment when we don't see an effect on the OCT because the patients have become familiar to reading the OCT themselves. So switch or not to switch, visual acuity more than 6/7.5 and persistent edema we can watch. No, we need not consider switching. We can stop the treatment and see what's happening. Visual acuity less than 6/7.5 and persistent edema, then we would probably consider switching, particularly if it is less than 6 months. As I mentioned, most of the improvement with anti-VEGF agents happens in the first 6 months, and we give these injections and find that the patient's vision is less than 6/7.5 and the edema is not improving, then we probably consider switching. After 6 months, probably doesn't make much of a difference. I hope all of you are still with me. That's amazing. Switch to what? I thought it was 10 minutes. Switch to what? The general trend is to switch from bevacizumab to ranibizumab to aflibercept. So there is a meta-analysis which was published recently where they have switched eyes which were on bevacizumab, ranibizumab to aflibercept, and found that the visual acuity improves by about 0.1 logmar over 6 months and 0.08 logmar over 12 months, and central macular thickness also decreased. And studies have shown that visual acuity less than 6/12, aflibercept is better. So do we switch if improvement is less than 6/12 in patients who are on bevacizumab or ranibizumab is a consideration we need to think. So on a lighter note, what the studies seem to say is visual acuity better than 6.5, don't treat, watch. Visual acuity is less than 6/12, aflibercept is better in the first 2 years. So corollary is switch to aflibercept if visual acuity is still less than 6/12 after treatment, and switch to ranibizumab. Visual acuity is better than 6/7.5 and less than 6/12, which is around 6/9. So there's one small group of patients who can probably think of treating with ranibizumab. And do we switch to steroid? Yes. And we can switch back to anti-VEGF? Yes. Both seem to work. After reading all these papers, and you think that like we are puppet somewhere and the puppeteer is somewhere else, I'm sure you can draw your own conclusions based on this. So when would I switch to steroids? If there was a recent vascular event, if the patient is pregnant, if there is DME with cataract surgery, if you are unable to follow up, the patient is unable to follow up closely and poor response to anti-VEGF. And maybe I will switch to steroids if there are hyperreflective dots, significant hard exudates, and neurosensory detachment, because there is some evidence to say that these presence of these factors, the patients respond better to steroids. So hyperreflective dots, one of our studies showed that like 4 times less number of treatment is required. And hard exudates, yes, they tend to resolve better with steroids, but even with anti-VEGF, they do resolve, but a little longer, a little later, that's all. But we need to consider the cost of the switch. This was a study which looked at the cost of the switch. Here it includes the treatment cost, the OCT cost, and if there are complications, managing the complications cost also. For instance, DEX implant or fluocinolone implant, anti-glaucoma medication cost was also included. So steroids are the least expensive to switch to, and fluocinolone, we don't have it in India as yet. And of course, there is always a small subgroup where we have to switch to surgery, where there is a thickened posterior hyaloid, which is not allowing the anti-VEGF to work effectively. And there is a tractional component. Yes, we need to go ahead and switch to surgery and subsequently follow it up with anti-VEGF agents also. So this is, and particularly in PDR patients, the posterior hyaloid that does play a significant role, and removing it seems to work wonders in these patients. To summarize, switch to another agent does seem to improve visual acuity and central macular thickness, and switch after 3 months and less than 6 months or first 6 months of treatment based on the visual acuity or CMT based criteria. As I showed, there are multiple criteria and best is to make our own criteria. So what would I switch to? Switch to another anti-VEGF or steroid depending on what is required in that particular patient. I need to switch if the patient vision is 6/7.5, I would probably stop treatment. On the other hand, there is a recent 5-year outcomes of the protocol T, which are published. And what you see is whatever you do, you treat all the patients with different agents, and 5 years later, all seem to be ending up in the same final destination. So we need to think before we switch or considering a particular treatment. So if not anything, I hope that I have helped you in your Sunday haircut, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Always a pleasure to listen to you talk. And like you said, though we have been talking about these same topics for the last 3 to 4 years, it's nice because every year we come up with something new at least. So any questions to Dr. MPS? Do you all have something different?
Also, yeah, he mentioned, Dr. MPS, you mentioned about this study which is published in 2020. There's another one post hoc analysis where they have shown very clearly also that 1/3 of the DMEs, they are refractory. So they remain refractory. So this is very convincing. In fact, that's a very good study, very convincingly shown that whatever you may do, 1/3 are going to be having a refractory edema, persistent edema. So that is very interesting. So those definitely require, I think we have to look at that. And that's a very good article. So I thought maybe you have had a look at that also, and which is very interesting according to me. Maybe that is one where we need to switch to steroids early, or I don't know. So this is my question.
Refractory after sufficient anti-VEGF and steroid and switching, maybe candidates for vitrectomy, because that is one way. Apart from, I am presuming that metabolic status and kidney status and all vascular status, lipidemias have been taken care of, because these are the patients who may not show adequate response what Mahesh and Mangat was telling. So we do have some decision-making points. We control metabolic status and all, because still, like Mangat was saying, there are substantial number of patients who will not. If they don't, then last point is, talk to the patient, talk, and ultimately consider surgery.
But the surgery doesn't seem to improve the vision in all the patients, isn't it, Dr. Lalit?
True. Because in any case, I agree, because surgery will be beneficial only if there is a taut hyaloid phase or there is a traction, or we are exhausted, all this. So, but if the still patient has, poor vision, only poor vision we are talking about, then only, because it has to be, either you maintain it, patient accepts that vision and he is happy with that. But if you have to intervene, because surgery, we don't want to do very extensive surgery. We just have to, vitrectomy and hyaloid peeling, that's it. That may seem easy, sometimes very difficult in diabetic patients also. But in this vertical follow-up, out of 100 patients of DME, we follow what Mahesh has said. And then if still resistant, as Mangat was saying, there is one option we can talk about.
Yeah,
I think
ultimately
that is
we'll reach up
something.
with an equilibrium of saying that we accept some amount of edema, we accept that there are some patients who will be refractory to treatment, and hope that we help the other patients.
Also, nowadays you see medical treatment like glitazones or sleep apnea or such things also have to be considered.
Yes, so that was a good discussion, and I think finally at the end of the day, sometimes the patient itself decides on the switch, whether they want to continue treatment, they want another drug, probably for financial reasons also. Chronic patients do tend to take a call for us sometimes. Going to
sorry for the problem is patient is dependent on you. You see, if you ask the patient, you take a call, so you have to be, sufficiently, you have to
yes,
inform.
sir, true. So going on to the next, from switch to combination, which one and when to do it for intravitreal treatment of diabetic macular edema? Very dear friend, Dr. Dhananjay Shukla, please.
Thank you, Chaitra, and I hope my slides are visible.
Yes, they are.
Yeah, so Mahesh has, as usual, spoken perfectly about as a prelim to my talk. Actually, his is the main talk, mine is just an add-on. So when you go on switching and you're exhausted your switches, and before you consider surgery, you can consider adding up actually. So when to stop switching and start adding. So now there are so many things to add actually, as Mahesh himself pointed out. So I have to specify what exactly I can deal with in the coming 9 minutes. So I'm not talking about combining injections with topical drugs, for example, dorzolamide, which may or may not help, but so far has not helped. Or combining injections with lasers, which reduce the number of treatments but don't improve the vision. Or for that matter, combining injections with surgery, which definitely improve the outcomes, but we're not discussing them here. And we are not even combining two anti-VEGFs, or with methotrexate. Again, these things do not have any confirmatory knowledge as of yet. So what are we talking about? We are basically reducing the stock to anti-VEGF and corticosteroid combination because they are complementary pathways. We know for ages, actually, since Tony Adamus said in an editorial, and actually there was an IVOS devoted to it, that is diabetic retinopathy an inflammatory disease? And yes, now we know that it is. So there are two pathways, vasculogenesis and inflammation, both of which have to be addressed. So we combine various anti-VEGFs with one of the few steroid options we have available. Most of the randomized trials so far, even with the recent search, are only on Avastin and triamcinolone, the good old buddies. And the recent ones, Excentrix and Ozurdex, there is only one randomized trial. Now, what is the rationale for adding after switching? Again, as has been pointed out earlier, this was shown even by ETDRS. Dr. Mangat just pointed out a recent trial, but it has been shown by Rise and Ride, and even before that by ETDRS, that close to half of the patients do not improve to 612 even after 2 years. And in fact, ETDRS showed that about 30% of the patients have a refractory macular edema even after 3 years of laser treatment. And there's another reality check, especially in Indian scenario, that most of them cannot afford such a long treatment, even if it is effective. And steroids have been proven to be effective even before anti-VEGF drugs came into the picture. And it is especially more effective when there is a chronic DME. This is where I want to add to what Mahesh said. He said that up to 6 months you can switch, and after that switches don't work. Why? Because the diabetic macular edema acquires an inflammatory character after about 6 months. So inflammatory pathways become activated in that much time. And this is when the steroids and anti-VEGF may complement each other. Why do I say may? There has been in vitro study which shows that there is less capillary leak, but there are no evidence-based guidelines for combination treatment. In fact, there is evidence that when you combine the two, complications combine, that is the cataract and glaucoma. And in fact, in some patients, even a risk of stroke or cardiovascular events when you are using Avastin. So complication complicates and not complements, but we can sometimes switch to the standard of care treatment with a different anti-VEGF, Ozurdex or vitrectomy. Now, what about the good old Avastin and Triamcinolone with which we have the best knowledge so far? Avastin works as well as the Triamcinolone combination. So in one line, if you want to say that the additional of Triamcinolone did not do anything better in terms of vision. Macula does dry up faster, however, with combination, which is what we are concerned. There are less injection required, so great news for the patient. And the treatment naive DME also responded similarly, which is again good for the patient. The IOP spikes and cataract. Now, IOP spikes never require trab. They are less with 1 mg than 4 mg. Most of us now use 2 mg Triamcinolone when we use a combination. And they are even less with preservative-free Triamcinolone, with which we do not have a study so far. Now, what about Excentrix and Ozurdex, the protocol U, which is the only RCT available now? So they had about 130 eyes with persistent DME. It was refractory to at least 6 injections, 20 given initially and 3 more before calling it persistent. And then 1 arm on Ozurdex and 1 on combination. There was no difference in visual gain again, but the macular drying doubled in combination at 6 months. And if we apply more stringent criteria for the refractory level, then there were better visual gains as well. And it looks non-intuitive. Drying is more with the combination. Why is the vision not improving? Because mainly we are treating the refractory DME. There is already a pre-existing photoreceptor damage. Now we have know very well that it is a neurodegenerative disease, and therefore the photoreceptors cannot go on the cycle of drying and edema repeatedly. So, and are we not used to no visual gain already? We have used grid treatment for diabetic macular edema for ages, and that never improved vision. Actually, we are always concerned about stabilizing vision. So, is the treatment of macular drying the macula worthy goal? Yes, according to TDRS, and it can get back to square one after 1 year. So, how best to use the combination treatment in DME? How do I use? In fact. One is refractory DME, and again, as Mahesh pointed out, after 3 injections, we generally call it refractory, and that is a lot of practitioners do even in Western countries also, as I just checked on retina physician recently. The treatment naive eyes could fare better, but none of us do a combination treatment naive eyes. But if we probably get a patient who has already had a chronic and diffuse macular edema, then it is probably worthwhile to consider a combination. Because these eyes may have an inflammatory component. And especially if the above are combined with PDR, it becomes more logical. And remember that Excentrix and Ozurdex have not been tried in a treatment naive DME. So this is one of the pictures we have. I tried this treatment, and Triamcinolone works even when an epiretinal membrane is present. This is very important to know because it reduces scarring. As again Mahesh has said, I'm just repeating that in presence of lipids, Triamcinolone works better, and in combination with Avastin, it dries up the macula and treats the disease. And this is a patient I have given about 10 anti-VEGF injections, a very bad-looking macular edema, a full PRP done. It did dry up with the combination, but again it had a subclinical or a baseline kind of edema, and this is my last follow-up at 3 years. So to sum up, the choice combination is Excentrix and Ozurdex if the patient can afford it. It can dry the macula. The intraocular pressure rise, which we talk about so much, actually does not happen so commonly in Indian patients. Even though the combination pack does not have added benefits in terms of vision and added risks, it reduces the treatment burden for the patients, so less follow-ups. So make sure of the IOP profile and cardiovascular risk. Remember that vision loss due to cataract is included in many of the studies of triamcinolone, so it might be actually better than what we know. And only it is applicable for the refractory DME. Do we want to dry up the macula without visual acuity gain? For me, the answer is yes, because it at least stops the multiple patient visits. When do we try it? When the anti-VEGF fails for at least 3 times. And it is worth repeating that diabetes has to be controlled along with hypertension and other systemic disease. Finally, as Dr. Mangat pointed out and Dr. Lalit also pointed out, learn to give up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dhananjay. Very crisp and clear with your thoughts and views on it. Dr. Lalit Verma, do you want to add on that? Because
I had one comment actually. You see,
Yes, sir.
both the talks were excellent and a lot of points were clarified. You see, Dhananjay said that instead we try combo, we try in desperate patients or failed patients. So there's not much enough data available in a naive patient because the vision does not improve in such patients, only the OCT improves. And that also he feels is worth it because it reduces the number of visits and that's okay. But why not start something trying in severe DME, a combo right from the beginning where the markers indicate that there is an inflammatory component also like HRF, SRF, such things along with routine DME plus all these things. So in such patients, is it worthwhile starting with a combo?
So I think I wanted to add to that because we've done a study where we've looked at the aqueous of patients when we are injecting, and we've seen that actually the VEGF load is very, very less in some of them compared to the pro-inflammatory markers. So like you mentioned, even in treatment naive, maybe starting off sometimes with a combo might help when it's very, very severe and you're attacking, using all your forces to attack the disease. Dr. Atul Kumar, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, see, there's a neurodegeneration which occurs in diabetic retinopathy. Don't forget that the anti-VEGF is not the only treatment of choice. There's anti-angiogenic drugs also, and anti-VEGF drugs. Plus, there is a neurodegeneration. And neurodegeneration is aptly seen in the ORTs, and you see those neurodegenerative things like you have those biomarkers, drill. So drill once you get and there's a loss of segmentation, the central 1 millimeter, it's unlikely that any further injections would really improve the patient much. So I don't know. It's a multitude of factors which play a role in non-responding DME or refractory DME. So I think we should.
I think one thing from my side, we need a study. I don't know why it has not been done. We need a study of this combo treatment with only steroid. I'm not talking anti-VEGF, with only steroids. That kind of a study. If we have like Ozurdex or Eccentrix or whatever with Ozurdex, because that way we will know it. Is it this combo working or it is only the steroid working? Because that is very important, because mostly we talk in terms of steroid being used for refractory DME. So that if we have a study like that, I think we'll have an answer to this and we'll know it. Are we giving an increased burden to the patient, or we are doing something which probably need modification? This is my take.
Sir, as you start sharing your screen, I have a quick question to Dr. MPS. Sir, would you start off with the combination for a severe DME in a treatment naive patient?
The present moment, I don't find there is much literature support to do that. So that's the reason I don't start. And like Dr. Dhananjay mentioned, again, expense is a concern. So there's no literature support to do that. That's the reason I'm not doing it.
And Dhananjay, one last, you said for a person who could afford it, your option would be Eccentrix with Ozurdex. So what is your option for somebody who cannot afford it?
Avastin with triamcinolone.
Great. Thank you, sir. Over to Dr. D for his presentation. Thanks, Dhananjay, again.
Thank you.
Sorry, I opened another presentation, so there was a problem.
Sir will be talking to us on DME progression after cataract surgery, whether we are underestimating the risk and how we can go about handling that.
My screen is visible now?
Yes,
is it
sir.
okay? I am audible? Okay.
Yes, sir. All good.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the DME progression after cataract surgery. I think all of us, we know that progression of diabetic retinopathy after cataract surgery is a well-known phenomenon. And it is much more in case the surgery has been complicated. As well as the proposed mechanism we should understand and keep in mind is the breakdown of the blood-retinal barrier and post-op inflammation. So these two things somehow we have to take care of. I think we knew it right from this ETDRS study in 1999 that if there is a mild NPDR, it may not really lead to worsening. It will do all right, like here it is shown. But in case of a severe or a moderate NPDR, it is going to worsen. So that is what is very important. I think this information we had right that time. And I just like to share one patient here, this lady. You can see the way why I've shown this patient is you can see there must be a lot of post-op inflammation in this eye. And you have well-placed lens. And she had, after 10 months, young lady, quite a progressive loss of vision. And when we look at it, this eye, right eye has a very mild NPDR. And look at the left, what has happened. That is what happened. It will come up like anything. You have even NVD and you have so much of edema here. Angiogram was done and you can see very minimal changes in the right eye, but left eye, you can see it is in front of you. So there are several studies which have shown association of ocular inflammation and progression of diabetic retinopathy. And the surgical experience leads to progression of diabetic retinopathy after cataract extraction. So I am going to harp on this again and again. You need a very good cataract surgeon for a diabetic patient, especially if there is a DME. And the long surgery is associated with, we know it, with increased post-op inflammation and increased breakdown of the blood-retinal barrier. So definitely it will lead to worsening. So diabetic patient undergoing phaco appear to have doubling of diabetic retinopathy progression in 12 months after surgery, which is of course much less than intra and extracapsular, which we had seen in past. And I think you must all look at this study in 2017. This is the data from entire United Kingdom. It is their electronic medical records. It has exactly shown the same thing which we had shown way back in 90, which I projected 99. The risk of treatment requiring DME increased sharply months after, 3 to 6 months after cataract surgery for all grades of diabetic retinopathy. But patients with moderate and severe are at particularly high risk. I think that is what we have to remember. So that part should be always, I think we have to be very careful. If you have these kind of patients, if you have somebody whom you don't like, send for the cataract surgery to him. So the posterior polar cataract, uveitic, or a hard or a pseudo exfoliation. I'm just showing one example here. You can see there is a retinopathy. This is the right eye. Left eye, complicated surgery was done. There was a posterior capsular rupture, part of the this thing, nucleus went in. But you can see what has happened. The eye was lost. There was subsequently even a neovascular glaucoma. So you have to be very careful. It can go like a fire. So in cataract surgery and DME, achieve a good metabolic. Don't rush up with the surgery. And diabetic patients undergoing cataract surgery should have a topical steroid and NSAID treatment for longer time. Don't tell your surgeon. They should know it. They don't want to use these days. They feel pride. I stopped my drops. That is a problem. So they have trivialized the phaco. And intravitreal anti-VEGF or steroids can be used during surgery. They can be used before or after the surgery. And there are a lot of them these days using, I'll show you many studies where the steroids, especially Ozurdex, has been used during the surgery or a week before the surgery. And this definitely reduced macular edema, especially in DME. So at this time, as I said, there is a paradigm shift. In past, we used to defer surgery. Now we tend to do early surgery. And The early surgery is done because we have intravitreal anti-VEGFs and steroids. These have resulted, and we require also, because down the line we can have better monitoring of these cases if we have removed the cataract in time. I'll show you this one case here, 60 years old female. You can see grade 3 intravitreal injections has been given. Also triamcinolone has been given. This is Avastin given. So many things have been done, and needs a cataract surgery. And you can see the Ozurdex was given right along with the cataract surgery. And you can see everything went back, improved. And this has been published from our group. This was a thesis of Anirudh Agarwal, I remember, in ophthalmology, along with Professor Gupta, Vishali, Dr. Jagatram doing all the surgery. They were giving, and you see, this became a benchmark. Even now, you look at this retina issue. They are giving injection during the surgery, and this is a routine in DME patients, and that is what is important. So what are the recommendations? Achieve good metabolic control first. Don't jump for the surgery. Use topical steroids and NSAIDs for longer time post-op. It is very, very important. An excellent and quick phacosurgery is the way to go. I always put this, avoid multifocal IOLs in DME patients. I'm talking of DME. You may have a diabetic patient because they do very badly. Mostly people don't publish on this because probably there's a problem because many of the maculopathy patients, they'll do very badly with multifocal. Pre-op or per-op intravitreal Avastin, Lucentis, Eylea, triamcinolone, Ozurdex, anything can be used. But Ozurdex I have highlighted, if patient can afford, use it. If your surgeon is not confident, you give it 1 week before and get the surgery done next week. Once everything has been metabolically controlled, they'll do very well. Otherwise, if your surgeon, most of them are not confident, Professor Jagat is himself giving it on the table, Ozurdex. So he's confident, so that is fine. But otherwise, it can be given earlier. So in conclusion, always inform the patient of a likely decrease in visual acuity. Once you are doing a cataract surgery, especially if there is a moderate to severe NPDR, I have shown you the data. And of course, if there is a DME, definitely, then you are going to also take action, do something. More people are using steroids than anti-VEGFs, but you can use anti-VEGFs also. And treat DME before and after cataract surgery aggressively with all these things. That is what is required. You need an experienced cataract surgeon. I have mentioned that. It leads to more inflammation if it is prolonged. It's complicated. And post-op treatment should be more aggressive and prolonged. Inform your cataract friends. Though these are different cases, give it for a longer time. So thank you very much for your attention. I think we can discuss this here. I'll stop sharing.
So, Chaitra, can I add a point?
Please. Please.
After such a nice, commendable lecture by my guru, I just want to say one thing that in diabetic retinopathy, the cataract surgery, if there is a patient with DR or DME or both, should get an early cataract surgery.
Yes.
Because
yes.
the earlier the cataract surgery, the posterior segment problems much better. Of course, as sir has mentioned, the monofocal lenses are the best. Because even if surgery is required, monofocals are most suitable for surgery.
Yes.
I think that was a very strong message for those, doing cataracts or, who practice both, how important it is to plan the surgery and the treatment of DME before and after. So you mentioned about one point saying laser even before and after. Just wanted to have your thoughts on the usefulness of doing scarab PRP in patients with extensive CNP without PDR actually on the response to the DME. Would you recommend that?
Yeah, I meant about the like what even Dr. Mahesh earlier mentioned. If we have a extra sort of a macular edema, what we call non-central involving, we can do laser in those cases before. So that is what my idea was. And of course, if you have, then the best option is, and if cataract is required, then there is an option of that kind of a combo here, I must say. We must give them something like Avastin or any anti-VEGF And if the edema has come down, they can undergo surgery. If you can do PRP, nothing like that, do it. Yeah, most of these cataracts are early, you can do it. Otherwise, I think here probably the role of anti-VEGF in a PDR with DME is much more. And then you can do a laser PRP if it is possible, and they can undergo surgery, definitely. And of course, if you find it is a more chronic edema, it is much more raised, maybe because it takes time for PRP for controlling, then you can even give something like Ozurdex before 1 week before the surgery. They'll do very well.
Santosh, I had a question for you. We know how to treat retinal thickening. We know how to treat these different patterns of edema. What would be your take on how to handle patients with a very large hard exudate plaque? And when do you stop treatment? When do you continue? What do you treat? How do you treat?
You see, I think we have seen them, all of us, we are so experienced, long time. They don't improve vision. You see, they lead to subfoveal fibrosis eventually. That we have to understand. So the best is that we should metabolically control these patients as good as possible first. And maybe, I think since there is some evidence, I'd say some evidence of using steroids intravitreal in these patients, maybe we can use that. But I think we have to inform the patient that most of them, they are not going to improve the vision, because they eventually, if it is a right in the center, the subfoveal fibrosis will be there, whatever we may do. That's how perhaps the other attempts of surgery, other things, whatever were being planned or done earlier, they are mostly abandoned.
The lipid lowering agents also, we have a couple of papers.
Yes,
from
yes.
So,
yes, very true.
I always start lipid lowering agents. I realized it's said by Emily Chu from NIE that even if the lipid levels are normal in DME patients, it's recommended to start lipid lowering agents, and we got excellent lipid lowering agents nowadays. And the ACCORD study also showed the positive role of lowering the lipids.
Absolutely. I think they benefit even systemically. So I think we are doing a lot of good to these patients, of course, from eye point of view, but as well as systemic. As you mentioned, the ACCORD study was not done for eyes, but for the systemic. This thing. Yes.
Any other points, Santosh?
When do we start looking at hemoglobin and renal profile in such cases, sir? Like when the case comes back with a non-response, or it would be ideal to start from the beginning? I mean, anyways,
I didn't talk about that. Our basic, which we always teach, and I have not put that slide. Basically, we have to do all the investigation and order ourselves. We order for blood sugars, especially HbA1c, lipid profile, as Professor Atul mentioned. We order for 24 hours urine protein, blood urea, serum creatinine, mostly people will order. Nobody gets for 24-hour urine protein. I have yet to see that, because those things get deranged when the parenchyma is damaged. It is too late. So don't wait for, if you order blood urea, serum creatinine, you are not doing anything good. So is HB, because most of these people are anemic. If they are anemic, then we have to look after that also, improve that. So all these need to be improved. So whatever the reports we get, we have to be telling our physician, diabetologist, or whosoever that, and I make it sure, I call them up many a time if the patient is very, very in a critical stage, that control everything. That is what.
I'll request Dr. LV to start sharing his presentation. And one last take, Dr. MPS, do you still do a lot of focal lasers, or have you stopped doing it after the injections have come in?
Yeah, definitely much lesser than what I used to. And focal laser, if there are visible microaneurysms, I go ahead and do focal laser. But diffuse edema, grid laser is something which is hardly being done nowadays.
Great. Thank you, sir. Next talk is by Dr. Lalit Verma. He'll be talking to us on whether we should stop the unending injections and just go ahead with that one surgery that is probably a one-stop solution. Over to you, sir. Thanks for being part of this.
Thank you, Chitra. Wonderful talk, Mangat, as usual. So thanks, Chitra, for having me in this lovely symposium. A lot of good messages are coming out from this. At the outset, let me confess that DME is not a single entity. There are myriads of approaches available, and clinical manifestations like upper right corner patient on dialysis, mixed kind of retinopathy, so much of boggy edema. So you can't have one tailor-made approach to every patient. So today, everybody, even general ophthalmologists, go on giving intraocular injections to all patients, any macular pathology, because they are easy source of income. But these are not uncommon. You see scenarios when patient comes with one dialogue which hurt me long time back. Lots of kitne injection lagaoge. So that was one which he was trying to say as if we are doing it for our own gain. So that is what sometimes patient may suspect. Lots of injection. So today we all understand that you see diagnosis is not difficult at all once you are doing photography and all. So my treatment generally based on combo picture of visual acuity, FA and OCT. FA, OCT alone should not be interpreted, and like Mahesh was saying, visual acuity if more than 6/9 or 6/7.5, that has to be considered as a central point. So this along with the FA and OCT picture has to be there. The reason I say so is because FA may reveal, far-flung CNP areas which you may like to target them or laser them in patients who have recurrent edemas, so that you don't keep injecting such patients. And very important for prognosticating also in ischemic kind of medullopathy. And OCT, the single most important thing apart from other parameters or hyperactive foci or biomarkers is to rule out tractional kind of edema. That is very important point. Although initially we used to distinguish between various types of edema, that today has not much relevance as compared with biomarkers or the traction. So based on all the available information, although we used to classify based on clinically significant DME, and this was the standard definition, what is the definition of CSME, and the OCT classification which is available as center involving or non-center involving. I would also like to add to this that we should also mention this is a tractional or non-tractional kind of edema. That from practical point of view makes a lot of sense. So here is a patient who has had multiple injections of anti-VEGF, lasered also, doing reasonably well, maintaining 6/9 vision. So there's no need to make it bone dry. All these cysts, all the fluid, it need not be made bone dry. If patient is maintaining 6/9 or 6/6 on this kind of regimen, I will hold on. I will not re-inject, especially if the OCT is stable during follow-up. So this was another patient who was fed up of injections. So one shot of Ozurdex made him dry, and subsequently his metabolic status improved, and his hemoglobin, as Santosh was saying, also stabilized, and the patient is doing well after one shot. I did not repeat other injections also. So here was this lady who had no hyperlipidemia systemically, but within the eye there was so much of exudation. So this patient, I started this patient not on anti-VEGF. The treatment naive patient we gave Ozurdex in the first shot itself, and this lady has received 3 Ozurdex till date, and there is an evidence of what I call vitreomacular adherence. This is, I don't think so, there's a traction. So in all these patients where seemingly there may be a traction, but this is, you see after Ozurdex, the OCT comes down, although adherence still persists. So as Nangat was saying, visual acuity does not improve dramatically. This patient had finger counting 3 meters. She improved to 6/36 to the max, and she's still maintaining that. So tractional kind of edema without visual loss, without much visual loss, meaning thereby that macula is relatively spared. Such patients required only observation. They need not be subject to surgery also. Like example is this patient was referred for surgery because she had the only eye, and the right eye was lost because of surgery itself. And this patient maintaining good vision, there's no need to intervene, even though there is some evidence of traction here. Coming to other traction edema where there is a visual loss. So then sometimes people may still try injection. So therefore, I've written query injection. Surgery is more definitive in such patients. So this is one example where you see this patient has had edema. So there was some patient already had some laser also. So there was some evidence of VMT also. So I did give injection in such patient. and there is resolution of edema, and patient did not require surgery. Although this patient had multiple injections and laser also. So coming to when visual loss is severe and because of traction, and then you do surgery. And in the beginning also, I was when we were discussing why I said surgery. Because surgery is relatively simpler compared to a surgery in a bad PDR or complication of PDR. This surgery we did in this patient of fractional kind of edema, triamcinolone assisted vitrectomy. Carefully, try to engage this posterior hyaloid and gradually increase the suction from 200 to 400, and gradually this PVD will get induced. And at this time, I think there is some time, doing membrane surgery. So cataract was, although not very dense, but it was interfering with the sharp visualization of the macular membrane. So cataract surgeon was called. And as Mangat said, cataract surgery has to be very, very good. You have to choose your cataract surgeon also. And he did a very good job, putting it not a multifocal IOL, but I never prefer multifocal IOL. Then we went ahead and stained the epiretinal membrane here. And the procedure I follow is I do a after vitrectomy, after hyaloid, I put electrode exchange and then put 1 drop of Retiblue here and identify this membrane with the help of 25 gauge MBR blade. And once this membrane is identified and edges identified, and then we take this forceps, Eckhart forceps, and try to remove this membrane. And after removing the membrane, you see the surface of retina is still looking cystic in the center. So I injected BBG dye also to peel ILM in all diabetics, but we do give it a try, and if it comes, it definitely reassures that all the pre-retinal components have been taken care of. But if retina is very boggy and you are struggling, then don't insist on ILM peel in all these patients. So this patient, I was lucky that ILM came out nicely, and that was the end of the surgery. So this is another patient who has had multiple injections, lasers also, and this was the OCT. And so after the surgery, which was done a long time back, this patient did improve in vision and also restoration of contour. This was another patient of tractional kind of edema. You see here, this patient also underwent similar surgery, which I have shown here. And this is the OCT contour after surgery. So just to summarize, non-tractional center involving diabetic macular edema, we always go ahead with injections or shifting of drugs to steroids or other drugs or Ozurdex or sometimes laser also. But if patient still is not responding or DME is stubborn, you have taken care of hemoglobin, erythropoietin, and everything, you can consider vitrectomy. Because literature does tell that in traction, definitely results are much better, but even without traction, although anatomical improvement is more than the functional improvement, but I think still it's worth trying because it may put an end to the injection. Just to summarize again, the same thing, consider vitrectomy after all routes have been exhausted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Just a few quick discussion points. Sir, do you prefer any pharmacotherapy at the end of surgery, after you're done with surgery?
Any?
Pharmacotherapy after you conclude surgery?
Not really. I do not give any pharmacotherapy. A couple of patients I did give Ozurdex, or sometimes I will not insist on complete removal of triamcinolone and allow some crystals of triamcinolone to be still to be there. That may work as anti-inflammatory post-surgery. Like because some patients I have given Ozurdex at the end of it, but numbers are very less for me to comment upon that.
Santosh, your thoughts on this? I think you do use some pharmacotherapy after TRDs, I think, especially.
Yeah, I put in IVTA after TRDs usually under oil also. So somehow I just feel like it kind of stabilizes it, anti-inflammatory, and the edema, whatever it is, that even that comes down. And some kind of hemostatic effect also, I just feel there is there. I mean, I'd like to have thoughts of the seniors.
There is a rationale of what Santosh is saying, and that is the reason you see I do not inject, but I allow those crystals to remain there and do not wash away every bit of it, with the presumption that they may have some inflammatory.
Dhananjay, what are your thoughts? You're muted, Dhananjay.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, sir said a very important point about vitreomacular adhesion actually. And that's what I want to point out, because a lot of time when you have diabetic macular edema, whatever adhesion of vitreous is there to the macula, we take it as VMT. It is not necessarily VMT. To call it a VMT, the center of the fovea should be distorted. In fact, right, it should be pulled up. If it is only attached and to the disc and to the macula, that is a normal anatomy, which or perifoveal detachment is what anatomically happens with old age. So this normal anatomy, we take it as vitreomacular traction and a license to do surgery. So VMA need not always be VMT, and sometimes it does respond to anti-VEGF or mostly steroids, as Sir has pointed out. Just all
VMA is a normal condition. VMA is a nearly normal condition.
Yes, yes.
So I showed the one example which there are more patients also where it is actually not VMT but VMA. But,
yes.
Yeah, that's rightly pointed out.
So can you please share your presentation? The last presentation is by Dr. Atul Kumar. He'll be talking about persisting DME even after a successful vitrectomy and how to handle it. This will be the last talk, and there is one question if somebody would like to take from the audience as well once we've done with this lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for including me, Austin. Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to meet up with people who have not met for many months and weeks since the COVID came in, and because of the COVID, we rarely get to go to physical meetings now, and probably it's virtuality which is going to take over. So I'll just, without wasting any time, talk about DME, which is persisting. So it's important to understand what is persistent DME. And we've already heard excellent lectures from the various speakers. So once you've got persisting DME, you have options which have been discussed. You switch the anti-VEGF combination therapy protocol that showed, which Dhananjay said about only the structural improvement but not the visual gain, and rescue laser surgery. So surgery is an option, and despite surgery you can still have problems because the edema still persists. So drcr.net, which is a very valid network of studies which are being conducted in various US hospitals for diabetic retinopathy and its various issues. One of the studies which was done by Julia Haller which was led by her, that showed that in case of vitreomacular traction, the visual acuity did improve a little bit in 38% eyes by 10 letters, but also decreased by 10 letters in 22% eyes. So it wasn't so, thickening was significantly reduced, but the visual acuity wasn't much. There's non-significant visual acuity improvement, and there was a decrease also in a reasonable percentage of cases. So the role of PPE in recalcitrant edema is very limited. You don't have to resort to DME till such time that you're dead sure that you will probably, not improve with any of the available anti-VEGFs, lasers, the patient's proper blood sugar, lipid is hypertension controlled. So if you have to do the Pasteurna vitrectomy, usually for the tractional DME or the severe VMT which occurs, that leads to surgery. And of course, in diabetics, the hyaloid tends to become thick. It is some kind of an abnormal deposition on the hyaloid, which makes it very taut. So the taut hyaloid, and especially with repeated lasers, the hyaloid in fact sticks onto the macula. So if there's, it is said that it improves the oxygen delivery once you do the vitrectomy, removes the inflammatory mediators, which we were just hearing from Santosh, and so it definitely helps maybe in some ways, but it's got a limited role. Finally, I'm telling you in this highlighted slide, that because there is discontinuity, have a look. I look at the the outer layers and the biomarkers, because once you've got a disrupted ellipsoid and large exudates in the center, probably you're not going to get much out of the surgery. This kind of a patient who's actually not got macular edema but got multiple ORTs, which is degenerated photoreceptor outer segments, and you have a hyperreflective border with a hyporeflective interior. So we always look at that, and I tell my residents that please, once you got this, the edema, and there's a loss of structural indentation loss, then these kind of patients will improve only partially, even with anti-VEGFs or steroids. So you get a refractory edema. And you can get a picture like this, which is actually VMT, and this is a hyaloid which is pulling onto the center. The central edema is actually the retina is being caught up and it's being pulled vertically upwards and might lead to a break and definitely a retinal degeneration. Such cases you might require a surgery. So I'm just showing a quick clip because I know the Chaitra is short of time also. So I won't waste much time on any of the slides, and just highlight the important points in each slide. So we have the Ingenuity 3D, which I like to work on, and the IOCT device. So once you got tractional edema, then with a severe vitreomacular traction, like you just saw in the OCT in the previous slide, then I know this kind of a vitreomacular traction is a wide, broad-based VMT, because it's classified internationally into a broad-based and a narrow-based VMT when it's greater than 1500 microns or less than 1500 microns. So I use a Brilliant Blue G dye, and with the Brilliant Blue I get a negative staining of the ERM over it, and the ILM I may or may not take out, because ILM removal in diabetics can actually cause more harm. So only if I feel that yes, probably the exudates will get exposed to the vitreous cavity, you may have more decrease of inflammatory mediator. So if there's a definite traction, I'll just do a little bit of it. I do a center, too much of cysts in the center. So the issues of post-vitrectomy, you might have a ERM formation after surgery, comorbidities, release of inflammatory mediators, though you may actually decrease, but they may exacerbation because there's an inflammatory. After vitrectomy, there's also a lot of inflammation. And the pharmacokinetics of the drugs, especially anti-VEGFs, change in vitrectomized eyes. So drug clearance is faster for anti-VEGFs. So always remember that in vitrectomized eyes, so you may need to give steroids only, it's Ozurdex or triamcinolone. And dose modification, as is recommended, that you should not reduce the dose. As in silicon-filled eyes, you do 50% of the dose, but in vitrectomized eyes, you give this full dose of the anti-VEGF. And this is vitreous clearance, which has been shown in the IOVS study, that if there's no PPV versus PPV, the vitreous clearance is very fast. So therefore, that is a handicap after vitreous surgery. So the role of intravitreal steroids has been very strongly highlighted by my guru, Professor Dogra. And there's a rationale of using glucocorticoids and reducing DME visual acuity. So there's a study which was done also from India by Professor Mangat Dogra and Professor Mohit Gupta and all from PGI. The fluocinolone astronide is actually a little controversial drug because it acts for 3 years and it may lead to a lot of glaucoma, but the UTIC has been given FDA approval for DME. So with this, I'll conclude my lecture. I hope it was useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We have actually a lot of time. So we would like your inputs a little more on a couple of points that we wanted to highlight. One question that Dr. Thirumalesh has asked is, would doing a PRP for severe NPDR just before cataract surgery not worsen or cause DME? So is pharmacotherapy better?
I think this is again directed towards me because I understand he's talking in terms of cataract. I think definitely, most of the time we are not even doing in severe NPDR these days, PRP, but definitely no before cataract surgery. So you only use definitely anti-VEGFs because we know that PRP is definitely going to induce some edema. It induces inflammation. So in an inflammatory eye, if we are going to do surgery, it is going to be a big problem. So even if you find the changes are very severe, you have a lot of CNP areas, IRMAs, and so many things, I would first give anti-VEGF and then do PRP if cataract is not that much. because these cases, otherwise they are very unhappy. I have already had experience with one very educated person, the same thing done somewhere else, when they feel very, very unhappy because the vision was worse than what was pre-op. So I think definitely that is my take. I don't know what Professor Atul and others are going to say.
I totally agree with you that before the cataract surgery, and I advise the cataract surgeon to get the surgery, to get the patient, ask the patient to get the cataract surgery done in the early stage of immature senile cataract, because they get cataracts also faster. And we have a problem in imaging, we have a problem in treatment. Also the fact that they could deteriorate further. So I asked them to get an early surgery from a very good surgeon, as it's been mentioned already, highlighted again and again, and a monofocal IOL. And then I definitely before surgery I advise the anti-VEGF, but maybe you do a little bit of targeted laser, because many of these IMSC eyes, they do permit some laser. So if the Octa permits, or through the media haze, if I can get a little bit of Octa, or I get a fluorescein done, sir. And if there's a little bit of ischemia in the periphery, I'll just treat the ischemic parts. Because if I do a full PRP, it's going to lead to macular edema due to the laser, worsen it. So I do a little bit of peripheral laser, because DR is not thought to extend all the way to the aura. So I'd rather do a little bit of peripheral laser, and of course anti-VEGF is the mainstay of treatment. Dhiru, that answers your question. You are my resident. Now you're working at such a big institution. There's the head.
Any other question? Santosh, you had a question.
Yeah, sir, I just to the seniors. Sir, actually, post PRP, in case of a very aggressive neovascular front, we know that the patient is not properly diabetic controlled. So we do a PRP, there's a taut posterior hyaloid, there's a minimal VMA kind of a thing at the macula happening. There's macular edema, young patient. 2 months later, the patient comes up with persisting NVEs, some amount of local hemorrhages. And how to go about in these cases? Like add PRP can worsen the traction, it can increase the bleed. Injection, what to choose? If there's a persisting macular edema which is causing a decrease in vision, steroids would be better in these cases. It's a phakic patient, young patient. Add PRP and choice of steroids. And if you are doing both, the time interval between the add PRP and injections.
If you got PDR, the size PDR.
Yes, PDR severe PDR. I mean, maybe it starts as a HR PDR. And
Santosh, one thing is there that the VMA is not to worry. VMA is more of a normal finding, as Dhananjay already mentioned. If you see VMA, it's a normal finding. So don't feel that laser is going to worsen it. So what you can do is gently, you should call it scatter. Because as ETL said, PRP is not the word to be used. You have to use mild scatter or full scatter. So as per ETDRS classification, we can do a little scatter laser, and also definitely laser. You do the anti-VEGF, and if it's very severe refractory DME, the combination therapy may work better. That you give anti-VEGF plus Ozurdex. I would ask Professor Dover.
I think I absolutely agree with what Professor Atul has said. I think these are mostly what you are talking about, the type 1 aggressive patients, where we have a lot of proliferation happening and we are very scared. So I think we have to do PRP in a way away from, as we understand, and you have to monitor them very closely, because many of them, they do land up into surgery if they are type 1 diabetics with the extensive proliferation. So that is what would happen. So they have to be all the time consulted, and we have to be very, very careful in case anything progresses. They should always be cleared for surgery also. If we are giving anti-VEGF, they should be at the time told maybe they need surgery if they produce some kind of a more kind of progression or a little crunch somewhere.
Yes, sir.
Great. I think we're almost coming to the conclusion. I will ask everybody one last question, and also to give a big smile at your camera for the customary group photo of our IC, which we've been doing. This time it will be on screen. So before I ask the last question, request all the people in my instruction course to please big smiles at the camera. In 3, 2, and 1. Thank you so much. So last question before we sign off. I know we spoke about DME. Which of y'all are using anti-VEGF for PDR and what indication? We'll start with Dr. Atul Kumar. Anti-VEGF for are you using, not using? If using, what is your indication?
I follow protocol S to partially some extent, which is Bressler's work. So in protocol S, he's advocated repeated anti-VEGFs. So I do a modification, a hybrid technique. I do anti-VEGFs followed by laser. I do more of targeted laser, TRP. But I don't agree that repeated anti-VEGFs because the patient may worsen actually. Ischemia may worsen. So I won't call him again. And if he doesn't come for his follow-up, there'll be a disaster.
Dr. Elvi?
So I also agree with Atul that I normally depend on laser more than the injections. So generally end up doing combo treatment. Initial will be injection for some time, and then ultimately my bottom line is patient should be lasered, because laser dyes always do much better than the non-laser dyes. So you laser them gradually, not in one sitting. Laser them in 2-3 sittings, and in between 1 or 2 injections may be required. But multiple injections, regular injections, is not my cup of tea.
Dr. MPS?
I was hoping that I'll be able to do injections and avoid pan-retinal photocoagulation, but there is a recent publication which says that patients lose vision, lose field, despite giving injections. There's a recent publication on just patients who are treated only with anti-VEGF agents. They have also lost visual, vision sensitivity in visual fields. That makes me wonder whether it's worth it. So as of now, it's only PRP.
Because I remember once you said that you actually managed to lessen the severity or change the grading of DR just with injection. I remember once long ago you had mentioned that.
That's not in a PDR, that's in an NPDR patient. That's in an NPDR patient. So I was looking for a longer acting agent, but there is a recent publication on patients treated with anti-VEGF injections also losing field. If they're also losing field, why not you just do PRP and then get away with it?
Correct. Dr. D?
Well, PRP, I think I'm in agreement with all what has been said. I think PRP is the way to go in such a case. Yes.
Dhananjay?
Yeah, same as everybody actually. So if you ask us, any of us, it can't be different opinion. Sir has actually mentioned a very specific indication for anti-VEGF. That is, if the patient needs an early cataract surgery and he has got PDR or a severe NPDR with macular edema. So these are the only indication where you want to give anti-VEGF instead of a PRP. So that's one sir has already told. I'm just repeating for the audience. And second thing is when there is a rubeosis. So when there's NVI, so obviously these are the indications for anti-VEGF. Thank you.
Also pre-vitrectomy. Dhananjay, also pre-vitrectomy.
Yes, of course.
Or you have a bleed, you have a vitreous hemorrhage there. Even if it is small, you would give and do PRP. I think I'll just add that.
Anything else, Santosh? Last words?
I think everything is summarized.
Okay, great. Thank you all. And I'm hoping to do this course again with all of you all. Thank you so much for being part of it for, I think, 3 to 4 years in succession. And take care and stay safe, all of you. Thanks, Padam, for your coordination. I hope we've given you back the hall on time.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. I thank all the speakers for the wonderful presentation and Dr. Chaitra, ma'am, for leading this session wonderfully. Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Chaitra.
Bye-bye.
A lot of learning.
Thank you.
Thank